Hey kids, hey subs, it's great to have you back. Now this one's personal for me because my main focus is being a father. Growing up, there were some father absentee issues in my house. There are things that happened that I feel like I'm still carrying a bit of a debt load for. And I'm grateful that it's one of those things in society that we're putting a little more emphasis on in terms of what are our responsibilities, what are our duties, what are the obligations that we have to the next generation. And not on some global sense of, hey, we're going to save the world, we're going to keep it turning, we're going to save the climate, but the next generation of human beings that look to us and have been given to us as a legacy, what are we responsible for them? My next guest is the founding member of an organization called Them Before Us. She wrote a book of the same name, and the homepage says Children's Rights Before Adult Desires. It sounds like a cliche, but really, if you think about it, there's no way on earth that as a parent, the children's rights shouldn't be the first and foremost consideration. Whether you plan the children, whether you want the children, or some of the other things we're going to discuss today. So, Katy, welcome to the show. Great to have you on. Why don't you give us a quick introduction? Tell us anything that I missed.
Yeah, no, you got it all right. We can definitely talk children's rights because I think that for a lot of religious Americans and even a lot of conservative Americans, we haven't heard that term, the rights of children, used outside the context of their right to life, which is their primary right. But children have rights on this side of the womb as well. When you're talking about a natural right, whether you're talking about the most widely ratified treaty in the world, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the rights of children to be known and loved by both their mother and father are universally accepted. And those rights, when defended, could decimate every social issue that we're facing in our country today and prevent an awful lot of heartbreak for kids. But what does that mean? It requires adults sacrifice their desires so the rights of children are protected. And that goes for all adults. So one thing we do at Them Before Us is we say the onus is on all adults, single, married, gay, and straight, to conform to the rights of children rather than expecting children to sacrifice for the adults. And unfortunately, our culture is seeped in this mindset that if adults want it, they should be able to have it. In fact, sometimes they frame it as adults have a right to it, even if it means violating children's actual rights. So there's a lot to say, a lot of places we can go, but this is, I believe, the greatest battle of our time, because if we don't get this right, our society will collapse.
So, a personal story. I was on a page of someone I actually interviewed during a business podcast years ago, a very successful entrepreneur who went on Shark Tank. And she was featuring for Gay Pride Month back in June, which originally I was going to have you on then, and we could do a, hey, Gay Pride Month's over, it's July. Let's get back to reality and talk about the aftermath. But she was featuring these two dads who had 3 kids in vitro. And if you can imagine, I mean, there's a huge following, right? 800,000 followers. And it's like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, love, 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 love. So amazing, amazing, amazing. And there's one person who said, wait a minute, like, what's going on here? These 2 barely 20-year-old dads have 3 kids. Like, who's the mom? Where'd the kids come from? What's going on? And then the next 50 messages are, you're a hateful bigot. You should die a horrible death. I hope you get COVID. And that was kind of the tolerance pattern that was on this thread. I'm doing air quotes and hand signs that you can't see over here. And so I had made a comment that, and by the way, before I tell the rest of the story, your book is one where I felt like I just assumed I was going to know most of what was in it already. I really wanted to read it and I want to support you, but I was pleasantly surprised. There are swaths of information that I was unaware of. There's whole chapters that I have downloaded and listened to again on fatherlessness, I'm saying this because I want to remind myself this is what we're going to talk about, fatherlessness, sliding versus deciding, and especially the end of the book where you talk about the multi-billion-dollar, no checks and balances, no regulation industry of, I can't remember the name now.
Reproductive technology.
Reproductive technology and pay for conception. And that's what I'm getting on with this. These guys paid a fee. There's a mom somewhere who doesn't want these kids. They don't have a mother now. We're pretending that they're both a parent, even though they're like one's a second parent, which is what they call them. And nobody's stopping and saying, so is this really in the best interest of a kid? No, it's love, 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 love. So I made a comment, hey, really, there's no substitute for a mother. Like, can someone just tell me where the mom is? And I got blasted. So I started, the people that weren't insane, I kind of dialogued with them, and I made a comment that you really should pick up a book called Them Before Us and read it and think about some of the concerns that these kids are going to grow up with, not because they have gay parents, but because their identity is a mystery to them. There's no legal obligation for them to know who their mother is, what their medical history or what their genealogical history is. They're going to start asking, when identity is the number one currency in society today, which it is, they're going to have a lot of issues figuring out where they belong and what their place is. And so you take all the issues that come with fatherlessness or mixed parent families and you amplify those. And if you point that out, that just that it's a possibility, people hate on you. So when I mentioned your name in your book, the first one was like, oh my gosh, what a hateful racist bigot. I hate her. Everything's made up. And I thought, you can't get through these people. It's all one-way traffic, but we won't really know for 20 years. And it's not just, and I want to make this clear. You talk a lot about LGBT, but how we got here is because the Christian conservative founding fathers believing virtue, how do I want to say this respectively? The people who believe in the virtues that make a society strong have kind of missed the boat a little bit. You've got divorce, you've got abortion, you've got split parent families. Those foster this attitude that it doesn't really matter. The kids won't be affected. They'll figure it out and society will move on. So I threw a lot at you. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, well, let's start with the fact that what you saw in that Shark Tank episode is characteristic of how these conversations go. It obsessively focuses on the desires of adults. That's probably the number one thing that people say to me after they read the book, after they come in contact with our work is, I can't unsee this. Why is it that whether you're talking about cohabitation or gay parenting or sperm and egg donation or surrogacy or even like who has a right to adopt, that it's always just about the adults. It's obsessive. I mean, like, it's literally obsessive over what the adults want. The whole story is framed in my longing, my loss, my desires, my identity as an adult, right? And everything needs to conform to that, no matter how much the child has to lose. And so that is probably one of the biggest things that our followers say is, I can't unsee that. I can't unsee that the child is literally either absent or a footnote in these news headlines, in the legislative efforts, in even the conversations I'm having with my friends. The kids are last. And that's what we want to change, at them before us. We want to put them, the children, before us, the adults, in every conversation about marriage and family, right? And so that's, now that you understand that children have a right to their mother and father, we can hopefully get into the details about how detrimental it is when a child loses their mother and father, especially intentionally, right? We've always had child tragedy in terms of father loss when it comes to tragedy, like generations of kids losing their father to war. Historically, we've experienced mother loss when women used to routinely die in childbirth. That is not the reason why kids are losing their mother and father today. Today, kids are losing their mom and dad because adult desire is prioritized above their rights. And that's not progress, that's regress, right? So that is the place that we are now, is we are promoting mother and fatherless homes in the name of progress. But the victims are always the kids. It's always the kids that have to sacrifice. So yeah, like when you hear the term modern family, your children's rights brain should simply think child loss, right? Anytime a child's being raised in a modern family, it means the child had to lose something they had a right to be in that family. So yes, we need to get away from looking at everything through the lens of what adults want and begin looking at all of these conversations and issues through the lens of what do children have a right to.
I want to go back to, I mentioned this to you previously, but one of my first interviews I ever did on this channel was with Robert Oscar Lopez, who, for those who haven't seen it, I'm going to repost in the link. It's a couple of years old.
Children's rights champion. Children's
rights champion. So grew up, and I might get the details a little sketchy, but grew up with a lesbian mother in basically a commune for LGBT, people. And he said growing up at that time, it wasn't fashionable for them to have kids. Kids weren't accessories. They weren't tools to normalize relationships. They were a reminder that people on the ranch were straying and that they weren't being faithful to their lifestyle. He goes, so I was not treated well. I was not loved. My life was a mess. And he also talks about the difference between having one parent versus two parents and having non-blood parents that you're competing with your blood parent for affection. And that's something you talk about in your book that I haven't really thought about it very much. If you have a stepchild and someone comes in and marries your mother or marries your father, you're now in competition with that person for their affection. It's not as much of a teamwork as blood relatives. It's she either loves him or loves me. Who loves more today? Who's the first choice? And I've kind of experienced that personally. Anyone who's been through divorce knows what that feels like. So you're taking that and then you're putting another variable in there of now, and you do a really good job of this also, when you make this assumption that kids are going to be fine, you're saying, let's take all the diminished outcomes of stepfatherdom, of foster care, which are not good at all, and let's add another mix into that, which is now you don't have a mother and a father, you have two dads or two moms, and you have to pretend for their happiness that doesn't bother you and that it doesn't affect you. You just should be grateful. It's kind of a gaslighting for children. Talk us through that a little bit.
Absolutely. Chapter 1 of the book is why children have a right to their mother and father. So we cover that from every angle. Chapter 2 is why biology matters. parent-child relationship. Chapter 3, why gender matters in the parent-child relationship. Chapter 4 is why marriage matters to kids. Okay, and why marriage is a social justice issue, because it is the only institution that unites the two people to whom children have a natural right. But let's spend some time talking about biology. Now, we open that chapter with a story from a family researcher and child psychologist who says, in my 50 years of family practice, I have noticed this strange phenomenon, that when a child sees their mother loving their father, they feel like their mother is loving them. And when they see their father loving their mother, they feel like their father is loving them. And it's one of the very few instances in the human experience where you can be loved indirectly, right? Somebody can love somebody else and you interpret it as love for yourself. Now, take that in contrast to children who see mother's boyfriend kissing her in the kitchen, or dad with the new wife, right? Getting all dressed up to go out on a date. The child rarely sees that as, oh, my father is loving me by like talking up, taking his new wife out, right? Or, oh, my mother is loving me when she is showing affection to this guy who moved in last week. Okay, so that is not the circuitous, triangle of love that kids experience with their own married mother and father. Instead, what happens is just what you said. The child feels like they have to compete with this new person. Maybe there's no hostility, but they certainly don't feel love when their mother or father is showing affection to this new arrival in their home. But very, very often they see it as, I have to compete. And very often, unfortunately, the new adult sees the child as an obstacle to what they are pursuing, which is the romantic interest of the parent of that child. And then we talk in detail in that book, in that chapter about biology matters, about what are the practical outworkings of that. And they have incredibly serious effects for kids. First of all, biologically related adults, the mother and father, are statistically, now there's exceptions to this, they are rare, but statistically, the most protective of children, the most connected to the children, the most invested in children in terms of time and energy and resources. And non-biologically related adults are the opposite. They are statistically, especially men, cohabiting unrelated men, are statistically the most dangerous person in a child's life.
There's even a name for that, right? The Cinderella effect.
Yes, and that is not something that is coined by religious observers.
Walt Disney.
That is a term that is coined by evolutionary biologists who say there's no genealogical benefit to the to perpetuating the line if you're going to show affection and invest resources in somebody who is not your genetic child. And so you see this in the animal kingdom, but they're like, unfortunately, you see it starkly in the human race as well. Children are exponentially more likely to be abused or killed by a stepfather or cohabiting boyfriend. Now, thank God, most boyfriends and most stepfathers are not abusive, but if a child is abused or killed, very often, if there is an unrelated adult, that is the person who is responsible for the abuse. And so those non-biologically related adults are less likely to invest in children, less likely to put into their college fund or spend time with them. And then the other reason why biology matters, something you mentioned in your scenario of two dads with these three children, is biological parents give something to children that they crave, that they long for, and that is biological identity, right? Kids are always asking the question, especially in adolescence, who am I? And largely throughout human history, a huge piece of answering that question is, I am the child of my father, or I am the daughter of my mother who were Italian immigrants. And, every Christmas we get together and we make, the family sausage together or whatever it is. These days, right, children who are intentionally raised without their mother or father, they don't have those same critical biological and kinship networks to help them answer that question. And so that they suffer from what sociologists call genealogical bewilderment, identity struggles. Who am I? Where do I belong? I don't look like anybody in my family. I can't connect my identity to a larger genealogical story. Now, that sounds like no big deal, right? For people who are like, well, love makes a family. Well, it's a big deal to kids. We know that because we have thousands of kids who are scouring the internet, trying to find their missing mother or father after they were created through sperm and egg donation. Many of us know kids that were adopted, who then maybe in their 20s or 30s desperately try to figure out who their birth family was. Why? Because there's nothing unusual about wanting to know the two people responsible for our existence. What's unusual is denying that it has any level of importance for a child.
There's a line, I've been thinking about a couple of things while you're talking. One of them, you got a line in the book. You said, when was the last time you watched an epic movie or a 3-part series or read an incredibly enthralling novel about someone traversing heaven and hell to find their long-lost stepfather or their father's girlfriend? It doesn't happen. Like, people do that for mom and dad, for family members. So my kids are going to watch this when they get a little older, and it's interesting. I don't know what the cliche will be then, but over the last 10 years, it's been love is love. Any argument you have, any biases or prejudices or diminished outcomes you're predicting, love is love, which means shut up. And my issue with that, as you just said, is according to the psychologist, I think it was Dr. Fagan, right? I'll have to link to that in the study.
That was his quote.
Love is not love at all. In fact, you refer to it as the socioeconomic diet that children require, and that's the loving mother, loving father, and a safe home. What's the third one? Stability. That those are required. And if you're missing one of those pieces, you have a diminished outcome statistically. Right. So what I find interesting when you're talking to people is they'll recognize that for divorce. And on this thread, I'm divorced, or my parents were drunk, or my mom abused me, and I'm thinking, that's how we got here. People who said my mom abused me or my dad was a drunk now say, look, it doesn't matter who the parent is, because it can't be any worse than what happened to me. And so when I have rational conversations with rational people, I say, you notice that when it comes to the new fad, which Robert Oscar Lopez talks about, accessorizing children so that gay couples can feel normal, right? If they can't procreate on their own, they have to get a kid somehow. So his argument is that in slavery, one of the biggest sins we committed was we treated people like property. We bought and sold people so that we could satisfy a need that we had. He goes, we do that with surrogacy and with gay parenting because we are robbing those kids of a part of their identity. And people freak when you tell them that. But if you look at it rationally, if you have someone who, I've lost my train of thought already, but if you take
you're exactly right. Separation of children from their parents has been the hallmark of most of the great evils throughout human history. And that was probably one of the gravest offenses against people treated as chattel is the routine separation of children from their parents, right? So it's amazing because we fought a civil war to end the practice of buying and selling people. But when you take a deep dive into reproductive technologies, and when you listen to the stories of kids themselves created through these technologies, what you see is that is exactly what's taking place today. The buying and selling of people, the commercial separation of children from their parents. And again, in the name of progress, right? In the name of love, which is just the most morose, terrible, distorted way of thinking about the world.
We refer to it as a bastardized counterfeit of the proxy love that was provided through Christianity, right?
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Not my words, but nice.
Well, if you think about, you said earlier, there's only a certain way that a kid can feel, what if they can call it a circuitous love between parents, meaning love stacked on top of love that's not sourced from them. Like, I think of that as your relationship between God the Son, God the Father, and the Holy Spirit. There's a way for you to multiply or exponentially increase the amount of love without you having to really put in much input because of a relationship that you have. When you water that down and say love is love, despite the fact that you're adding in these pieces that don't match, you're offering a counterfeit. And what we teach in our home is that the counterfeits, the close relationship, closely worded, inferior replacements of true principles make people miserable. And that's what I see when I look at this. So, and you had a line where you said, you can't use the language of woke self-satisfaction the other direction. So if I say, look, love is love and we want to have a family and be proud of us, if you say that to put kids in cages or to separate them willfully from their parents is invalidating their humanity, then when you put them in a gay family, quote unquote, that's not invalidating, that's empowering, and that's going to help the kid. So I always ask the question, how do you take all those diminished outcomes and make it better by comparing this relationship to, they always say, well, it's better than foster care. Well, it's just as good as adoption. I'm like, why are we taking the lowest, why are we taking things that are less than the ideal and settling for those as an alternative to the ideal?
We spend the whole first half. So the chapter 4 is about why marriage matters, right? And when you're talking about the 3 staples of a child's social emotional diet, mother's love, father's love, stability, marriage is the only way kids get this stability. There is no stability outside of the marriage relationship. We then tackle divorce because the original redefinition of marriage, where kids were expected to sacrifice for adult desires, was the passage of no-fault divorce. So generally, our country is not in the position that it is in now in terms of the failed, dismal state of the family because of the gays, right? Like heterosexuals led the way when it came to normalizing marital breakdown and when it came to pursuing reproductive technologies. But then the next chapter is on same-sex parenting, right? Because that is a huge topic, and it is one of the greatest examples of adult desire being prioritized above children's rights. And we spend the first half of that chapter examining the research that shows that there is no difference between kids raised by by same-sex parents and those raised by heterosexual.
Of course
parents.
not. Love is love. It's all the same.
Right. Love is love. Right. And so a little cheat sheet for people, right? When you're looking at studies that are not examining outcomes for same-sex parents, okay, when you're just looking at family structure in general, and we have decades of research on family structure, right? And what sociologists overwhelmingly agree on, whenever you're not talking about two moms or two dads, they agree on three things. Number one, biology matters in the parent-child relationship. There are specific benefits conferred to children when they're raised by their biological parents. Number two, gender matters in parenting. Mothers and fathers offer distinct and complementary benefits to children. Men don't mother, women don't father, kids need both, right? Number three, anytime you are looking at the trauma of parental loss, whether that takes place through death, divorce, abandonment, sperm and egg donation, even if the child is subsequently adopted after they've been abandoned, children's rights are diminished, even if they're raised in a loving, married, heterosexual home. Okay, so then, riddle me this. Why is it that when you start studying same-sex parenting, suddenly biology doesn't matter, gender doesn't matter, and there seems to be no trauma and diminished outcomes from the loss of a child through death, divorce, abandonment, reproductive technologies, even though those are the only ways that a child could find themselves in a same-sex parented home. So why is it then that all of these things that matter so greatly when you're studying family structure suddenly have no relevance when you're talking about same-sex parenting? And the answer is because those studies are deeply flawed when it comes to their methodology, right? Generally, they don't use random participants. They either recruited or had volunteer participants. Oftentimes, they don't measure the actual outcomes of the kids. They simply survey the parents. How do you feel like your
self-reporting, right?
Two moms. I'm sorry?
Yeah, self-reporting. Rate yourself as a parent from 1 to 10.
That's exactly right.
I'm good at this.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And my co-author, she's the one that makes the book a really great read. She's got such a way with words. But, she said that we were talking about this recent Italian study that surveyed gay fathers, lesbian mothers, and heterosexual couples. And amazingly, it found that the kids of gay fathers, the kids of lesbian mothers were doing so much better than the heterosexual couples. What was their method of evaluation? And it was just the adults rating their own parenting experience. And she said, in Realville, we call that heterosexual parents are more honest about their shortcomings than gay parents, right? And that's really what it is. So we spent a lot of time looking at the research on same-sex parenting. And then the last half of that chapter is just dozens of stories of kids who experienced devastating mother hunger or father hunger because they didn't have a mom or dad. And that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody who knows a child who was raised by a single mom. Even people who, I've known military wives who have had to deal with the deployment of a husband, and the 4-year-old is starving for male affection and walks up to any man that they see and say, "Will you be my daddy? Will you be my daddy?" Kids long for male love and female love. And now to say that kids don't care if they have two moms or two dads means kids don't care if they've lost their mom or dad. That's ridiculous. And you don't need to take my word for it. We've put about 25 stories of kids who had two moms or two dads into that chapter, so you can read their stories for yourself. And there's no way you're going to come away from this going, oh yeah, it doesn't matter. Love is love.
Wow. Well, you articulated those issues very well, because that's what I was trying to get at, is how do we pretend all that doesn't exist, and that being in a gay relationship, having gay parents solves those problems magically when there's less stability in those relationships, and among other things. But I think I'm not here to focus strictly on that, but to build up to all these issues as a whole, and how we just kids' feelings and get lost in the shuffle. And I'll use another example. A couple of years ago, my most liberal, most progressive, Rachel Maddow daily watching uncle on my wife's side, great guy, incredible human being, very progressive, he was a union guy his whole life. So his solution to most things is, well, everyone should join a union. Well, if you join a union, you make more money. If you join a union, they take care of you. Join a union, you have a job. I actually got him to admit at the kitchen table at Thanksgiving that teachers' unions are giving all the other unions bad names. And the reason was, I asked him if there was a student union for kindergartners that they ran themselves and they were concerned about their own needs and their own best outcomes, would they be in line with the teachers' union? He said, no, absolutely not. So, okay, so now we're getting somewhere. And I look at this very much the same way as if the parents are allowed to self-report and talk about what's best for their kids without actually consulting the kids or looking at the data, we put ourselves in a dangerous place. And you say a couple important things. You mentioned earlier, fathers reflect the world, mothers reflect the home. There's a nurturing and a guidance. And being without a father in my home as a young kid, there's a lot of things about being a man that I had to learn on my own. And there was a huge cost to doing that without a father that would guide me. Huge cost. So you talk about privilege and disadvantage. And some of those things I still play catch up on, nearing 40 years old. And so when people talk to me about those topics, I just kind of laugh and go, you can't pretend that these kids will turn out all right if you take out what did you refer to them as? When a parent or parents leave the home, it's like their own personal two towers falling down. You compare it to 9/11, which I thought was a great line.
Yeah, that's kind of how we opened the divorce chapter is when people experience traumatic events, it's seared in our brain. And we talk about how every single one of us remembers where we were on 9/11. Well, you talk to a child of divorce, and most of them have very vivid memories of the moment that their parents said, we're getting a divorce, because it is their twin towers falling, and it does irrevocably change their lives going forward. They are, if you're talking about the three staples of a child's diet, mother's love, father's love, and stability, in the best case scenario, kids getting 50% of mom, 50% of dad, but stability's gone, right? We've totally misunderstood divorce. We've thought about it, well, it's a bad cold, the kids will get over it. No, it's much more accurate to think of it as this is the first of a lifetime of losses and transitions and traumas that the child is going to have to go through and experience. And we have, of course, reams of data on divorced children of divorce, and we see that their mental, physical, emotional, relational, academic health all drastically suffer. Now, that's not to say that someone like you who grew up without the ideal, without having his own father in his home, loving him every single day,
for a while,
or that kids of divorce or that kids of same-sex parents are doomed. They're not. Right? But they do, to pretend that they do not have additional struggles, heartaches, and obstacles that they have to overcome to find that life of thriving flies in the face of all the data that we have, right? So we have to be clear-eyed about the cost to children when we decide to build families on platitudes like love makes a family and biology doesn't matter, because kids are going to pay that price. And I love what you said, right, about teachers' unions. One of our other taglines at Them Before Us is giving children a voice in the debate over family structure, because this conversation is dominated by adults. We have submitted a few letters to different legislatures who are trying to do things like strip the word mother and father out of their parenthood laws, or normalize commercial surrogacy, or redefined parents as having no biological connection to the child. And we submit letters to the legislature just quoting kids who were created through sperm and egg donation and probably raised by heterosexuals who said, my sperm donor is half of who I am, or I struggled with my identity issues, or I feel like I was bought and sold. I feel like I don't like being the product of a commercial process.
Yeah.
Right. And it's one of as far as I know, nobody else is literally putting the voices of kids in the midst of these conversations that we are having. And unsurprisingly, the voices and the rights of kids fly in the face of what many adults are advocating for today.
So let's get into that. I was thinking as you were talking, when it comes to watching the Twin Towers fall in your own home, you've got in the social media posts, you've got these kids wearing matching moccasins, you've got matching booster chairs and safety seats. You put all this work into what they wear, what they eat, where they go to school, but you miss the most important thing, or the weightier matter, which is what's their socioeconomic diet in the house. And if you get that one wrong, I know from personal experience, there is a price to pay. Let's talk about the surrogacy issue. And I think this is the biggest surprise in the book, because I'm guilty of this. When you see someone, what's the comment you made? What's the difference between, I'll come back to that. Your human trafficking comment was awesome. As Christians, we instinctively know these things. We're taught these things. We're criticized for believing that some of these values are old school and love is love and it doesn't matter. When it comes to surrogacy, and the checks and balances that you have with adoption and foster care. My sister's doing foster care right now. And when you talked about that comment about dad, this little kid calls every adult man dad the first time he meets him. Dad, 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 dad. It's wild to see it. I saw watch him do it with my brother-in-law. And I go, oh, he thinks you're his dad. He goes, no, he does that to everybody. He walks up to me, hey, dad, can I have a drink? Hey, dad, can I do this or that? And you go, there's something going on here. But when it comes to the next step above that, which is surrogacy, which is designing and delivering a child that you basically order like an in-and-out drive-through to the highest bidder. You talk about there's no checks and balances. It's $1 billion industry. The industry doesn't care about the rights of the natural parents at all. And the amount of stories you had, the heart-wrenching stories of people talking about what this did to their lives, I don't think most people have any clue what the next swell, the next tsunami is that's coming in 20 years. Can you kind of help lay it out for us?
Yep. Surrogacy, unfortunately, is a topic where there's way too much moral confusion among conservatives and even among Christians. And I understand, because we love babies. I love babies, right? Pro-lifers, we love babies. We think surrogacy is about babies. Surrogacy is about allowing infertile couples to have their own child in a way where it would never be possible. So surrogacy is not about babies. Surrogacy is about on-demand designer babies shipped worldwide.
There we go.
And surrogacy is the means for any and every adult to get their hands on a child, even though they would never qualify. Many of them would never qualify to go through the adoption process. So a few facts that are relevant to this issue. Of children created in a laboratory, which all children of surrogacy are, okay? But this does include couples that are using IVF, even to create their own genetic children. Only 7% of those children will be born alive. IVF, surrogacy, reproductive technologies is never a child-friendly process. Okay, most of those embryos are either going to be thawed and discarded, disposed of because they're not viable, deemed the wrong sex and discarded, spend their eternity in a freezer, or selectively reduced, right? That means aborted because they have maybe an imperfect genetic marker or they're the wrong sex or whatever. 7% of these kids will be born alive. And then if you're talking about surrogacy, especially, most of those kids, many of them are going to be preterm. There's diminished health outcomes because of the genetic dissimilarity that takes place between the surrogate and the baby that's inside of her. Okay, so what we are doing with surrogacy is so wildly outside of the bounds of the biological design, it is always going to harm children. Okay, now here's the next thing you need to know about surrogacy. Surrogacy splices one woman, the mother, into 3 different and very often optional women, okay? So motherhood is supposed to contain all 3 of these things. Number 1, the genetic mother, right? The one that gives you your eye color, your hair color, your ethnicity, the resemblance, right? When I clear my throat, I hear my grandmother. I clear my throat just like my grandmother did. And she's gone, but she had a really big part in raising me, or, being involved in my summers. And every time I clear my throat, I think, I know, Grammy, I see you, right? So genetics, right? That's the egg that's provided. The next one is your birth mother, right? This is the first person you have a relationship, in fact, the only person you have a relationship with for the first 9.5 months of your life. And the day that you are born is not supposed to be the last time you see your mother. It's supposed to be a continuation of the 9.5 months of bonding. We don't put newborns on the chest of random strangers so they can forge a bond. We put newborns on their mother's chest because they have an existing bond. And adoptees who have lost their birth mother on the day that they are born describe that loss as a primal wound, something that has interrupted their natural and very human need to bond, attach, and trust. They're not wrong, right? Adoptees do have disproportionate struggles, even though they are raised very often by adults who are more highly educated, wealthier, and who spend more time with them than even biological parents, right? So even though adoptees statistically have some advantages, they do tend to struggle disproportionately, many of them would say, because of that primal wound. Third, a mother is supposed to be the woman that raises the child every day. She should be the one that is in the home, providing that maternal love, that representation of the home that we talk about in chapter 3. And here's the thing. When it comes to these 3 mothers, none of them are optional in the life of the child. Every single one of them plays a critical role in a child's identity and development and thriving. Surrogacy allows you to, in essence, pick a la carte Which one do you want? You've got a womb, but you need an egg. Just cut us a $20,000 check. Look through this egg catalog. Determine, do you want an Asian mom? Do you want a white mom? Do you want a Hispanic mom? Do you want one that went to Columbia? Or are you okay with a community college mom? Because those are at a discount. Okay, so like if you don't have the genetic mom, we can provide that for you. Oh, you've got an egg, but you need a womb? No problem. We can find a woman whose body we can rent out for 9.5 months. If you want a white woman who's in your city, it's going to be about $20,000 more. But if you're willing to rent the womb of a brown woman overseas, we can really cut you a deal. And finally, the presence of a social mom, right? And a lot of times, especially in the case of single or gay men, they determine that the kid doesn't need a social mom at all. Right? We're going to purchase an egg, we're going to rent a womb, and then there will be no maternal presence whatsoever. And so what surrogacy very often results in is not the loss of one mother, but the loss of three, or a combination of those. And here's the deal. A child losing any one of these mothers, they will suffer. There is no way to do surrogacy in a way where the child does not pay the price for what adults want. And that includes the sweet, Christian, infertile, heterosexual couple down the street who would be great parents. If they use a surrogate, what they're really saying is your primary relationship, right? Let's say that the child's going to go to the genetic parents afterwards, but on the day the baby is born, that kid, those parents are just two strangers out of 7 billion, right? Or maybe we're at 9 billion now on the planet, right? The baby doesn't know anything about the genetic parents, right? Who, yes, are going to provide the genetic identity that the kid craves later in life. But on the moment, the day that the baby's born, it's not their bodies the baby wants. The baby wants their birth mother's voice and sound and milk and smell. That is the only person the baby knows. And it's an injustice to intentionally separate the child from the birth mother. So surrogacy, unfortunately, is never child friendly. And for those of us who really care about the rights, the thriving, the well-being of kids, we have to get this one right.
Wow, very good summary. I feel like I'm actually reading directly from the chapter. It was fantastic. I think that there are people who would say that and say, you know what, Katy, you're being dramatic. It's not a big deal. I had all these diminished outcomes. I had these challenges. They're going to get over it. Who cares? But the point you're making, and if I was talking to my kids about this, which I will when they get older, is you make a concession. When they say, hey, well, what about hetero couples? They can't procreate either if they're infertile. Yeah, sure. What is it? 4%, 10%, 6% of I think it's like 4 to 6% of the population. We make a concession, and we should be honest. We make concessions. There's a cost and a trade-off, and it's not one that's ideal. It's one that's manageable or that we are accept. But that has opened the floodgates to everyone should be able to make this concession. And you've got stories in your book. One, you kind of mentioned it. If someone's heartless and doesn't care and says, hey, the kid will get over it, no big deal. It's someone else's problem. All right. Well, the genetic dissimilarity causes additional risk for surrogate mothers. And you have stories about mothers, one, who are affected for life in terms of their ability to procreate, and also in terms of the child's rights to that person who doesn't care about the diminished outcomes. Let's say, what about the legal issues? If you go to adopt, and I've had friends that did this, if someone says 9 months ago, you're going to have this baby, I just found I'm pregnant today, you can have it, I won't even charge you, take the baby, give it a good life. If they decide after that baby's born that they want it back, they get to keep the baby. Mm-hmm. If you're a surrogate and you pay the fee and the mom changes her mind, so what? Screw you. They paid, give the baby up. Talk about that.
Yeah, let's do a real shakedown of the differences between adoption and reproductive technologies. Okay. So a lot of people are like, well, sperm and egg donation, surrogacy, those kids are being raised by their non-biological parents, so it's just like adoption. And we make the case in chapter 9 of the book that actually it's the exact opposite of adoption, right? Adoption is a child-friendly institution. Reproductive technologies are an adult-centric marketplace. So they are different in several ways. Number one, as we just mentioned, in both of these cases, the child is being raised by an adult who is not genetically related to them. Okay, here's the difference. In adoption, the adults are seeking to mend the wound that the child has experienced. In reproductive technologies, the adults are creating the family wound. Okay, now because of that, that's number one. Number two, because of that, the child over here in the adoption situation is able to be honest about their loss, right? My adopted son has experienced sadness and questions and confusions over why did his
Go ahead.
Why did his biological mother leave him in a box? right after he was born. And we have sought to paint that in the most noble, valiant way that we can, because we don't know the circumstances, but there is loss there for him. And so he can express that to us. Why? Because we didn't choose for the biological mother to abandon him. We are there to seek to mend that wound and shepherd him through it. Children raised through sperm and egg donation and surrogacy, if they are to be honest about who is my real father, does my biological mother know that I exist? I don't like that I don't look like anybody in this family. I'm concerned that you paid $100,000 to purchase me.
For me, that's a big one. Like, how much did I cost? Yeah. Really?
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
Kid Jeffrey down the street, he was 150 grand. Why were I 100? Tell me about, like, I would struggle with the economics of it a lot.
Well, and they do, right? And we give dozens of stories of kids who feel incredibly commodified. But if they were to share those losses with the people that are raising them, they are talking to the people who wanted it that way. So what does that mean for the child? It means that the adoptee is more able to be open and honest about their grieving and loss. The child conceived through reproductive technologies needs to bury it and hide it.
Should be grateful. He's alive.
Yeah, be grateful, right? And so the one study we have that compares outcomes between adopted kids and donor-conceived kids, adoptees do better. Very likely because the child in the reproductive technologies situation is bearing a psychological burden on behalf of the parents. Number 3, and this is what you've been alluding to through several of these questions, in adoption, the child is the client. In reproductive technologies, the adult is the client. So I used to work at the largest Chinese adoption agency in the world. Oof. And my founder, and the director of my agency, she said, Katy, you need to understand, the adults are paying us, but the child is the client. If adoption is done well, every child who needs parents will be placed in a loving home. But not every adult who wants a kid is going to get one. Not every adult should be able to adopt a child, right? In reproductive technologies, it's the exact opposite. An adult who is willing to pay will get a child no matter what if they have the money. And so we talk about in the chapter on surrogacy, one of the sections is called Dangerous Dads, where you've got predators, convicted child molesters who are procuring children through surrogacy who never would have passed a background check, who never would have been able to adopt. This is true for kids created through sperm donation as well, right? The mom would never have been able to adopt a child as a single mom, but she can go down to the sperm bank and get whatever kid she wants.
Pay to play.
If you have the money, right? And so adoption is child-centric. Adoption exists really to support the rights and well-being of children. Reproductive technologies, the goal is to get adults their custom-ordered child, no matter the cost, literally, no matter how many dollars it costs, and no matter what it costs the child. And so these two are not the same. Adoption exists to protect the rights of children. Reproductive technologies, 100% of the time, in terms of third-party reproduction, violate the rights of children. And so the two are not equivalent at all.
It is funny in the war of cliches when you talk about the background checks, right? The same people that would say, look, everyone needs to have a month-long background check. They shouldn't be able to buy a gun. But when it comes to kids, it's like, hey, they're gay. They can pay. Let's call it a day. Like, it's good to go. And the same thing with separating kids from their parents. Remember a year ago when everyone was complaining about separating kids from their parents? Your big theme is when you intentionally involve yourself in this transaction, you've intentionally separated a child from their parents for life. And you've also put the onus of being grateful for it on them. Hey, look, you're alive. You have a loving parent. Like, shut up. Yep. Everything's good. Exactly. You had a story in here, and there's a ton of great stories. There's kids that were produced in surrogacy that believe the whole practice should be completely banned. You don't ever hear about them on the news. I don't see them getting a lot of coverage. I think that'll be more common as the next 10 or 20 years go by and we find out how much, and this is Robert Oscar Lopez, when you find out what the damage is, it's 20 years later and everyone's already accepted the narrative. Exactly. And then you're just picking up the pieces. And we're going to see the next iteration of that. But you had a really interesting one. I just wrote down here surrogacy horror stories from people, and the one in particular from gay men. And it was one where there were two gay parents, I think one biological who was the dirtbag, and the other one was actually a loving parent. But when it's surrogates or non-biological, as screwed up as family court laws are, they become even more upside down. Do you remember that particular story? I
don't actually think I've got a story of two gay men where I don't think that was mine, but we do have horror stories of gay men who have, like I said, one where you've got abusers that are creating children. One, what happens when you commercially separate children from their mothers? Well, you've got the millionaire in Japan who is called the baby factory dad, who had like dozens of kids through dozens of surrogates in Thailand and in India, who chose the eggs of white women, and so they're not involved, right? He's the only biological adult, so now he has custody of 20, 30 kids that are all being cared for by nannies, in Japan. I mean, like, this is such dystopia.
It is wild, too, because there's all this talk now about how corporations are terrified of the woke mobs and being called racist in the press. And you have these baby factories like, yeah, you want a white mom? You want a blonde, blue eyes? Of course we're not going to give you a brown one. Pay up.
Yeah. And there's lots of stories in there about the eugenics, the aspects of that. We've got donor conceived children talking about how they are a product of eugenics, right? Like that you are selecting out certain people from the reproductive gene pool because they have less desirable traits. I mean, like, this is not, this is everything that we have been fighting against in terms of like dignity and human rights. It's all being trashed in the name of give adults what they want.
Yeah, we're almost out of time. You mentioned earlier selective reduction and embryo disposition. I hadn't heard these terms before, so I started Googling them after I read. And the one you had was where essentially if there are more embryos than the person pays for, the mother at that point does not own them. Walk us through how that works.
Well, yes. So if a woman is, reproductive technologies are moneymakers. Okay. And to maximize the money and reduce, the amount of times that adults have to implant and create embryos, it's incredibly common to create a dozen embryos, even though you really just want 2 kids, right? So something's going to happen to the other 10. But also, it's very difficult for these pregnancies to take. And so oftentimes you will implant 4 embryos or 5 embryos into a woman, thinking, okay, well, maybe we'll get 1 or 2. Well, what happens when all 4 successfully implant? Well, that's an incredibly high-risk pregnancy. And what if you've got 3 little girls and 1 little boy, and you're like, well, wouldn't it be nice to have boy-girl twins? And so they selectively reduce, which is abort between 12 and 20 weeks, the children that they don't want, the children that they deem unacceptable. Maybe one of them has a disability. Whew, well, we paid a lot of money. We wouldn't necessarily want a damaged product. When it comes to surrogates, right? Much of the time, the laws are being written to the point where the surrogate must abort. They must abort, even if it's a healthy baby, right? And so it's written into the contract, and we cite some of those contracts in the book about the requirement for surrogates to abort the children, because the intended parents run the show, not the kid, not the woman whose body is doing all of the work. No. And so what happens if she refuses to? Well, we have situations like that in Thailand, baby Gammy. The parents refused to take that baby home because he had Down syndrome. The surrogate's still raising that kid, right? We've got situations of surrogates. There was a huge story in Ukraine, right, where the baby was born with disabilities and the parents are like, we're not taking that home. And so even better, if you can just abort that kid before they're born so you don't have to deal with that messy, unpleasant optics of abandoning a baby that you commissioned and created. And so that is written in. It's standard in surrogacy contracts that the surrogate has no right to determine whether or not the children are aborted. The intended parents absolutely rule the show. And so what abortion really is in surrogacy is quality control and quantity control. And it is not something that is, it's not infrequent, right? It is standard operating procedure for surrogacy. So back to the original line, surrogacy is never a child-friendly process. Kids are always going to pay the price when you are creating them in laboratories. There's no other way around this.
The other story was, I remember what it was. It was a gay man who had a sister of one of the men who was the surrogate mom. And when they had the illegal.
Yep.
We're almost out of time. You got a sec? You want to tell that one real quick? That was the one.
So that's the story of Frank. We actually submitted an amicus brief because Frank's case went to the steps of the Supreme Court. They didn't hear it. But in that case, the state of New York determined that Frank, even though he was the biological father, lost custody rights to his ex-partner, who was the genetic uncle. But in the world of gay marriage, in the world of post-Obergefell, the law must accomplish biology never could, and that is making 2 parents of the same sex the parents of a child. And so in that landscape, biology and the importance of biology is gone. Right. So even though Frank was the biological father, they determined actually that Joseph, the biological uncle, but not the biological father, actually had more rights than the genetic father did. So that's the world that we've got. Right. When you redefine marriage, you redefine parenthood. And now it's considered discrimination to say otherwise.
Yeah, and that was Lopez's point. You should make meaningful distinctions between gay marriage and gay parenthood. Otherwise, the kids are screwed. And that's why we have to put them before us. Katy, I know you're in high demand. You got to go. I really appreciate you spending your time on here. I'd recommend anyone listening to this to share it with someone, especially those of faith who take it for granted that there are things going on out there that they don't understand and that they're buying into cliches like love is love that are unwittingly harming children and will harm future generations. They need to be aware of what it is that's really happening. The book is Them Before Us. The website's Them Before Us. And Katy, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, thanks so much for giving me time with your listeners. I'll just say a word to your followers of conviction. There's a lot of compromise taking place out there in the world when it comes to Christian and religious communities. Keep in mind that if you do that, if you forsake God's design for sex and marriage, what you're really saying is kids need to pay the price so adults can live as they please. My understanding is that religious communities, and especially Christians of convictions, are there to protect the fatherless. If you compromise on this issue, you're endorsing and manufacturing fatherless and motherless children. Good luck reconciling that with your faith.
It's not good. It's not good. Thank you so much for your time and best of luck with your foundation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.